Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Capital Connection. I'm Conan Smith. I'm the president and CEO of the Michigan Environmental Council. We are here for our final show of the year. Thank you to the loyal viewers who are rejoining us today. We're going to do a recap and just sort of open conversation with two of our favorite people, direct from journalism, Lester Graham from Michigan Radio and Garrett Ellison from MLive. Lester, Garrett, thanks for taking time to be with us today. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. Welcome.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, folks in the audience, you've probably heard Lester on the radio, read Garrett's incredible reporting on issues like PFAS. You should know that not only are they great reporters in terms of elevating our issues, they're well-recognized reporters in their own right. Let's see. Lester, you recently were recognized by Clean Water Action, one of our biggest and most active member organizations. I was at that event earlier this year as they celebrated the great journalism work that you did. Garrett, you have been watchdogging issues across the state of Michigan and built an award-winning profile of the PFAS contamination in the west side of the state, which is now one of the biggest environmental issues that we're grappling with statewide. Tell the audience a little bit how you guys got involved in the environmental aspect of journalism.
I was a business reporter in Grand Rapids for quite a while, and it started to, I guess, disinterest me, some of the stuff I was writing about, and so I begged off. I started looking for something else, and the editors at the time offered, environmental and Great Lakes as something that needed. We didn't have anybody doing it at the time, and so I jumped at it, and I've loved it ever since.
How about you, Lester?
Yeah, well, I was in Illinois. I was news director at a series of stations. The last one was in St. Louis, Missouri. I was the public radio news director there. And I'd done environmental stories throughout my career, and that was pretty well known at the time. And Michigan Radio had the Great Lakes Radio Consortium going on, which was a regional outfit that covered the entirety of the Great Lakes. And they called me up, and I said, yeah, let's do that. And it's been a good ride ever since. 23 years now with Michigan Radio.
So let's talk a little bit about the big issues that we're covering over the next few, that you've covered over the last year. I'm sorry, everyone. We have a holiday party at my house today when we follow this up, and folks are arriving. So forgive me if I get distracted through the middle of this. Three big issue areas that you guys covered: water, climate, and then solid waste and recycling issues. I want to talk a little bit with each of you about those as we go along. Water started out the year like huge. In the legislature, we had bipartisan sponsorship and support for a multi-billion-dollar investment package in water infrastructure, in groundwater protection, in public lands protection that would help protect the headwaters. So tell us a little bit like how those water issues were factoring into the reporting that you were doing this year, whether that was Benton Harbor, for example, on the west side, or PFAS or Great Lakes levels, that sort of thing. What did you see over the last year with the public's response to water issues?
Well, I'll start over because I spent a lot of time doing water issues this year, particularly on water infrastructure. I'm with a group of other media outlets, including Bridge Magazine, Bridge Michigan, Detroit Public Television, and Circle of Blue, and we tackled a big project on water infrastructure and what it would take. Now, the influx of federal dollars has been amazing. That's the good news. The bad news is it's not going to fix the problem for Michigan statewide. There are a lot of water systems and wastewater systems that have been neglected, not brought up to date, not kept up, because everybody's worried about the cost of water, and nobody wants to raise water rates to replace some of the old lines when they can keep fixing them, but they'll only be able to keep fixing them so long until we have a real crisis. So I'm happy to see that Michigan's getting a good package of federal dollars to help correct that. It's not enough though, and the state and local governments are going to have to get together and try to figure out this balance between the price of water that they're charging their people and the cost of actually maintaining a system.
Yeah, that for us, when we think about like the clean water aspects of our work, certainly we want to make sure that water coming into the pipe is clean, water coming out the back end of that pipe is clean. There's a whole lot that happens in the middle, and the cost of that is pretty extraordinary and differential across the state. I think that's one of the things that we've seen and struggled with. Municipal water systems handle these challenges in radically different ways, resulting in radically different quality systems.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see the conversation evolve around water affordability, particularly in Detroit, and some of the efforts over there in terms of, ensuring that the efforts that started, it sort of finally coalesced and during when COVID came around in terms of moratoriums on shutoffs and that sort of thing is sort of continued. I think that's maybe a through line in terms of 2023 is to keep an eye on, how that conversation is going to go and whether that's something that's going to resonate, in terms of the new control that the Democrats have in Lansing.
I watched a panel a week or so ago with Gary Brown from the Detroit Water Authority, Sewer and Water District, and Monica Lewis Patrick from We the People. Two folks who've been a little bit at loggerheads over the last 5 years or so around affordability and access. And it was really neat to hear how their relationship has grown and how they're approaching collaboratively this idea that nobody should be without access to water. If you can make that work in a city like Detroit that has really complex infrastructure issues in terms of the age of that system, compounded by a population that is, I think, 30% plus are living in poverty right now. If you can make that access issue work in Detroit, we should be able to solve that in every one of our water districts.
There are examples across the nation in different cities that are looking at pretty novel ways to decide how they are going to pay for their water systems and how they're going to charge their public. I know a lot of people would disagree with some of the approaches, but it cannot continue the way it is right now. It'll be a tough job, whatever's done.
So infrastructure wasn't the only water issue that we saw a lot of action on. Of course, there were algal blooms, the perennial challenge in Lake Erie, the sort of scourge of agricultural runoff pollution on our inland lakes and streams. What about those conservation side, aside from the infrastructure? What are your readers been interested in on the water conservation work side?
Well, I think the algal bloom thing is an interesting topic area, right? Because it seemed like there was some positive development in terms of Lake Erie. Like there was a positive development that came along with this court case from Lucas County, the Toledo area county, and the Environmental Law and Policy Center in Chicago. They won that settlement that's going to kind of hopefully result in the TMDL, the pollution diet for Lake Erie. But in Michigan, we've still got this CAFO permit that's like tied up in court, and so there's it like with most things, it's this sort of like two step forward, one step back, 2 steps back kind of thing. So, something that I wanted to get to this year, but I didn't find the time for was to do and I'm hoping to next year, is to do a comparison on how many inland lakes in Michigan are getting algal bloom, seeing spiking algal blooms, and is there more over a year-over-year basis, right? Because I think we had almost about, according to like Eagle's got this interesting new interactive tool where it's like about 30 inland lakes in Michigan, including a couple up in the UP, like Gojubek.
Mhm.
up in the Western UP, you know, are having confirmed cyanotoxin, cyanobacteria blooms, right? And so I think the question is that becoming more prevalent, you know, and like you saw it extended into November. And it was you know, a new algae species sort of, you know, helped extend that. And so, you know, we've got this sort of evolving thing going on with the algae blooms, and it doesn't appear to be getting better. And some of, you know, there's like, you know, work around the margins going on in terms of, you know, efforts to stem the flow of nutrients into our waterways. But I don't know if we're making good progress there or not.
Yeah, it's
On the
been
inland
hard.
lakes, I'm sorry, on the inland lakes, you know, one of the real big issues is, of course, there's ag runoff and lawn care runoff and things like that. But there's also the problem of our state's unregulated septic tank systems, which is a major, major deal for Michigan to tackle. That's as far as the inland lakes. As far as the Great Lakes, I like the pollution diet solution that Ohio's come up with. Here's the problem. We have this changing scene with Erie every year. And a lot of people say it depends on, you know, how much they're putting on the fields. That's only part of it. When there is not a lot of intense storms, all of that phosphorus is stored in the tributaries and creeks and soils until that big gully washer rain comes, and then all that phosphorus gets washed into Lake Erie. So you can't really measure that in any way except by decades. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. The other thing that I think we're going to see next year is, I think the International Joint Commission, the body that monitors the Great Lakes Quality Agreement, is going to put out a report in 23, and they're saying, look at Lake Erie, Saginaw Bay, and Lake Huron, Georgian Bay, both sides of the border. We've got this big ag pollution problem, and US, Canada, you've got to do something about it.
Here, here. You know, this is interesting coming up for next year, because it's a topic that's enjoyed bipartisan support, but it's been stronger on the Democratic side of the aisle than on the Republican side of the aisle. So if you have a change in leadership, does that bipartisan nature of this, the solutions to this issue, then get it across the finish line? Septic regulations a great example of that. We've got lots of rural Republicans who see the challenge with the inland lakes and streams that come from failing septic systems. They recognize that rural poverty is a real thing, and so being able to, you know, the cost of replacing a septic system is pretty tremendous. So could we get financial tools to accompany regulation under a changed leadership, enjoying bipartisan support? Be super excited to see that.
Yeah, the you know, it's such an interesting problem, because in those poverty-stricken cities or townships where your house might be worth $25,000, $30,000, and you have to replace a septic system that might cost you $20,000, the math just doesn't add up.
Yeah, it's really hard. I know that in that big water supplemental that passed in January or February of this year, we included about $30 million for grants and loans. I know, drop in the bucket though, right? Like, we got to have a more comprehensive funding and financing approach for residents to help them. You know, it's in the public's interest that those waterways stay clean, and you know, if we can't get the private landowner to take care of it on their own because of financial reasons, got to provide the right supports. Let's segue into climate. You know, the governor's My Healthy Climate Plan came out in May of this year. Really good work, comprehensive look at our climate challenge and what Michigan can be doing. Laid out what our 2030 goal ought to be to participate in the global effort to mitigate climate change, and clarified a whole bunch of important strategies, from the adoption of electric vehicles to, you know, fixing up our building envelopes to, you know, getting more renewable energy on the grid. A great report, great strategies, and it's going to take, you know, action on the public sector, the private sector, the residential sector, in order to achieve all those things. What are you guys seeing as elevating in the public's interest around climate as an issue and the solutions? Are people there where they can envision solutions yet?
You know, I hate to start off with this, but whenever we write about climate stuff, we still get emails from people who are like, who are not sold on it.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that you struggle with a little bit. When it comes to the climate piece, my sense here is that we're in this place of mitigation and adaptation, and trying to struggle with how to how to deal with the effects of climate in a state where we're not going to see most of the serious climate related issues that other parts of the country and other parts of the world are. Like some colleagues of mine just published a big report looking at Michigan as a climate haven.
Yeah.
And how that's gonna affect land use, infrastructure, planning, and everything over the next 100 years or so. And so I think it's I was looking at sort of the notes before we got on here, and this idea of like the climate plan that came out this year, is it how big of a moment is that? And just sort of thinking like it's a great big moment if we can stick to that plan, but what does it look like in a year, a year later, when we're doing you've got these issues that start to compete now with the plan, traditional environmental issues, ecosystem protections. You get this last ditch effort to keep the Palisades nuclear plant open, and all this difficulty getting renewable projects cited and everything, and it's a bit of a mess. I think in terms of the climate piece, it's hard to find a clear throughput there in terms of this coming year.
What we've experienced is that more and more people understand that climate change is happening and that we are the cause of it. What they are really struggling with is it's been framed as this massive global issue, right? That like, what does my one little action do? Well, as it turns out, your one action accompanied by 10 million other one actions really do have an impact. So we've got a lot of work to do as an environmental community and as a public, as a government, to articulate these are the solutions that work and that matter. Like, and I do appreciate the climate plan, like laying a bunch of that stuff out.
I've been working with some students at both MSU and at the University of Michigan. When I say working, like a quick seminar and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a baby boomer, right? Those letters that Garrett's getting about people or climate change deniers are probably my age. I can tell you that the next 3 generations behind me are all in, and they are trying to figure out what can we do. What they're scared to death, and they want to know what is it I can do in my life, and they're working that out right now, which I think is interesting. As far as the government putting together climate plans, I'm glad that municipalities like Ann Arbor and Traverse City and places like that are putting together climate action plans. That's good. I'm glad the governor's got this plan laid out. But really, I think that we're seeing people take the lead is actually among industry and business, because it's part greenwashing and it's part this is really efficient and we can save money. Mm-hmm. And so that they're kind of taking up where the federal government during one administration will be putting that aside, and they see the writing on the wall. Industry and businesses, the writing on the wall. They know change is coming. They're preparing for it, and they're saving money in the meantime because of it. So I think as long as that trend keeps happening, we're going to get there. Maybe not as fast as anybody wants, but it's moving. It's moving more than it was 20 years ago.
We partnered with a number of other organizations to do a assessment of the governor's climate plan and look at like business as usual case scenarios and then the impact of the climate plan on emissions. One of the things that's pretty heartening to your point, Lester, is that in a couple of these sectors, the business as usual scenario has pretty significant decreases in carbon emissions because it is more cost effective to move to renewable energy. There is a market now for electric vehicles. So you're right. I think the private sector leadership that we've seen there has helped set the stage for even bigger action.
Can I make one more point? Garrett was talking about how Michigan is not going to be affected like some other place, like the Southwest or the West. They're certainly seeing a lot of changes faster. One of the things, though, that we're starting to see is the warming of streams and inland lakes and even the Great Lakes. And that's starting to hit the bottom of the food chain. And if you like fishing in Michigan, you should be concerned about climate change, because it's going to change what happens in the streams and lakes. One of the solutions, of course, is being talked about is just making sure that streams and lakes aren't denuded of trees, and then the other problems that go along with that, removing dams so that water's not still long enough to actually warm up, things like that. So it's a big job, but that is the most significant, I think, thing that's happening in Michigan that we need to tackle at this point.
So go ahead, Garrett. Sorry.
I was just gonna, I wanted to, kind of briefly mention there's some on the Great Lakes coastline, we've had this variability in the lake levels, and the Great Lakes tend to get, like, in the global climate conversation around sea level rise, they tend to get sort of like either lost or mischaracterized, right? We don't have the sea level rise here, but we have this like extreme variability in the lake levels, and we're in this period of decline from the 2020 peak. And now you've got some communities that are, starting to get into mitigation planning and a little bit of managed retreat of critical infrastructure and roads and that sort of thing. Interesting to see where that goes. And, I know there's been, I see in the chat, there's some discussion of inland lakes and whatnot. And I know that, the high water tables and the high water issue was experienced in land as well, particularly around lakes that didn't have like an outlet drain. And I know there's some, a lot going on in some places about, continuing efforts to deal with that problem now that the water's gone down, in preparation for it to come back up. I know we've got these extreme variability cycles that we're kind of going to get locked into, and it sounds like the timeline's getting compressed. And I think this adaptation, climate adaptation, I think is going to be becoming increasingly important.
And
Yeah.
expensive.
I totally agree with that. Like, we've seen just on the water side already, you think about these, the flooding that we're getting in Southeast Michigan and the infrastructure that's not ready for that. The rise of the Detroit River, so that you had, the riverside communities getting flooded to the point where they were sandbagging, right? We don't do that here, but yeah, now we do. So we've got to think of ways to adapt. For some folks, that's gonna be moving inland and upland, I think. So the last big issue I wanted to cover with you guys is solid waste. A couple like big issues that we grappled with throughout the year. We tried to get reforms to Michigan's bottle bill and couldn't get those across the finish line. But what we did, interestingly, get across the finish line are reforms to Part 115 of the Natural Resource and Environmental Protection Act, which are the solid waste and recycling composting regulations, laws. That package, we spent 6 years as an environmental committee led by the Michigan Recycling Coalition, negotiating a very complex package of bills, generated enormous broad support to the point where more than 100 of the 110 members of the House of Representatives voted for it, sent it to the Senate, where it just bogged down, mostly because of a single senator. And that senator's interests were primarily with the waste industry and the Chemical Council. He wanted to see some flexibility around oversight for them, and to include what from the environmental community was a really horrid inclusion in the bill, what they call chemical recycling, essentially the burning of plastics to create more fossil fuels, that was a recycling entity. Big fight in the legislature over that. Ultimately, his version of the bill passed, and it's sitting on the governor's desk right now. She's got a choice to sign it or veto it. What about these solid waste and recycling issues? Are people out in the communities aware of them, care about them, frustrated with the lack of recycling in their community? What are you guys seeing?
You know, if from where I stand, I think people just want to be able to recycle stuff without a whole bunch of hassle. You know, they just want to be able to take it out to the curb or take it out to the dumpster with the recycling, and you know, there it goes, right? That's how people, you know, tend to deal with trash. And I think a lot of people see recycling as trash, and you know, changing the mindset towards recycling as, you know, a waste commodity, as materials that can be reused, right? Like it's something that, you know, it sounds like this package of this legislation's got some money and some effort put into, you know, outreach and everything. I think the raccoons campaign is probably gonna benefit from this. You know, it's, you know, you think you mentioned that whole compromise thing, right? You know, can we get this package off over the finish line? You despite some of the efforts that the environmental community doesn't like in terms of the chemical recycling piece. It's hard to talk about it a little bit, you know, until we know what's going to happen with it, right? It's sitting in the governor's desk. You know, it seems hard for me to believe that she would veto something over the support of her own environmental agency, although she did just get rid of the director of that agency. So, you know, it's a bit of an interesting question, and it's interesting that was like the one of the few things that actually came out of this real duck session.
Yeah.
You know, for people who are not environmentalists, the one environmental issue they're really hyped about is recycling. So you've got this big bill, as you said, took 6 years to get it done. Politics is messy. That's why they say, you know, it's like sausage making. All I can say is I think environmentalists overall should just say, take the win, hope the governor signs it, and tackle the other issue later in another session of the legislature. It's a messy, politics is messy, you know.
We really brought out the big guns against that chemical recycling work, and had a very strong coalition of environmentalists ranging from local environmental justice activist organizations to statewide groups like the Sierra Club, all fighting hard to not get it included. The Democratic caucus voted unanimously on a package of bills that would revert to the House version that didn't have it. Unfortunately, that just wasn't enough juice in the Senate. I think, Lester, you're probably right. The governor is going to look at this and say, I got a lot of support out there from industry, from environmental organizations and conservation organizations for the broader package. Let's tackle the reform later. Not to prognosticate, but I think that's, if I were in her shoes in this year with this legislature coming in next year, that's the kind of attitude I bring to the table. We'll see what she does. The real interesting thing that the legislature did this year, so sine die, the last official day of session, is not actually the last day that they're in session, but it's set by resolution. And they set sine die for the 28th of December, which means that the governor can't pocket veto anything. She either has to sign it or actively veto it. Or I guess if she doesn't, it just becomes law after 14 days. So, you know, puts a little pressure on Governor Whitmer to put her cards on the table on this. Something to watch, that's for sure.
Yeah, she hasn't let us anything really, you know, the stuff that she's been out in the media in terms of her, you know, priorities for next year related to environmental and energy she had mentioned this, right? And it doesn't seem to have come up in any of the interviews she's done yet either. So it's interesting.
So last, give me a little bit of your prognostication, guys, as folks who engage with the public extensively on these issues. We've got this change in the government that's happening, where there's a Democratic sweep, right? The entire executive branch controlled by Democrats, both chambers of the legislature, the state Supreme Court. That's a lot of blue control over there. one would say great boon for environmentalists, but in truth, both parties have pretty strong environment and conservation caucuses within them, and both parties have caucuses within them that are beholden to industry interests. So with those 1 and 2 vote majorities in the legislature, do you guys think anything big is going to move, or what do you feel the pressure from the public will be?
Well, I think the thing that I'm interested to see, well, obviously, I think septic has a pretty good chance, particularly because it had a hearing, I think back in October or November.
And the
So-
Republicans have been introducing that bill. Yeah.
Yeah. But the other thing is polluter pay, right? And I think there's still a lot of latent outrage over what happened at the Huron River. And that the Huron wasn't like the only river that was getting, trashed in Michigan this year. It was the Flint River, St. Mary's River, St. Clair River, right? Those last 2 were Canadians. And the Kalamazoo River, the Kalamazoo River just keeps getting nailed. And so, I think that there's an interesting window here where would not surprise me. And in fact, I would be surprised if it didn't, there wasn't a big push on polluter pay, which if it ends up being the river thing that and the surface water issue that sort of puts a lot of headwind or tailwind behind it, it'd be kind of funny because it seems like that's more of a groundwater environmental cleanup remediation type of legislation, right? So
Right.
that's kind of what I'm looking for.
So I don't follow the politics in Lansing like some others do. So I talk to people who do. I talked to some pundits, and I happened to be at the Capitol for some other business, and ran into a couple of legislators and Democrats. And here's what the consensus is. Anybody who has any idea what's going to happen in the next session doesn't know what they're talking about. because the Democrats are made up of a lot of different factions. Getting them to unify under a lot of things is going to be a tough job in itself. It's a close margin, right? So it'll be interesting to see what happens with an all Democrat legislature majority and governor and Supreme Court, but I don't think that it's going to be next year. Suddenly, Michigan is the greenest state in the nation. I don't think that's going to happen that easily. So, but again, I don't know, and I don't think anybody else does either.
Lester, I was a Democratic elected official for 14 years, and what that taught me is that Will Rogers was right.
Yeah,
I don't belong to an organized party. I'm a Democrat. So, yeah, it will be interesting to see how they manage the government next year. Garrett, Lester, thank you so much for taking a bit of time this holiday season to share your thoughts and perspectives with us. And thank you both so much for the reporting that you do. You keep these issues in the public's eye. It helps us in the advocacy community so much. Your thoughtful coverage, challenging insights, just really, really great. We love both of you and are grateful for your being there.
Thanks much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Everyone out in the world, I hope you have a lovely holiday season. If you get a chance, make sure that you go online and make a donation to Michigan Radio, subscribe to MLive, and get some of this great reporting on a regular basis. We need to keep both of these fine gentlemen employed and covering the issues that we care about. So 'tis the season to ensure that we've got good environmental journalism next year. And I hope you all have a very happy and restful end of 2022, because 2023 is going to be a big one. We'll be back and excited to hang out with all of you, bringing you the drama of the state capitol. And Lester, Garrett, hope we can have you guys back on at some point next year to talk about some of the great things that are happening around environmental policy.
Thanks, Conan.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.